your company gives you a team of 3, 4, 5, 8 programmers to manage. If you continue seeing yourself primarily as a programmer, the way you lead and manage your team is going to be throttled. So at some point you need to let go of that label and think of yourself, yeah, I'm a programmer, I know what that is, but now I'm a manager. It's a new label. And I'm going to probably have to adapt to people being much better programmers than I ever was. And I'll have to become open to hiring people that were better programmers than I ever was. That's quite a shift, but it's exactly the same kind of shift that I'm talking about. It's finding one's new value in an area where one has not proven oneself yet.
Welcome to The Change Lead, the podcast providing leaders with the insight needed to get things done in a rapidly changing and complex world. Subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss an episode. Connect with our community of like-minded leaders on our website, thechangelead.com. Welcome to The Change Lead with your host, Babatope Ipinyomi.
Change starts with people. Organizations only change when people do. Now, leaders influence the ability of organizations to change. In a rapidly changing world, leaders and organizations may end up needing to reinvent themselves multiple times. To discuss this with me is Aneace Haddad. Aneace has been a successful tech CEO. He has experience in entrepreneurship, innovation, and even managing his own CEO succession plan. As an executive coach over the last 15 years, Aneace has had the privilege of coaching leaders of multinational companies across many industries. He is the author of the book, The Eagle That Drank Hummingbird Nectar. In this episode, Aneace and I have a conversation about transformational leadership, why organizations only change when leaders do. Hi, Aneace. Thanks for joining me today. Really looking forward to today's conversation.
Good morning. Me too. Looking forward to this. Great to meet you.
Thank you. So I want to start with your book, the book you just, I think, recently put out. I listened to the book. I found it very engaging, very layered. So a lot of times you read a book or you listen to a book and it's just a single, monolithic piece of work. You've got lots of layers in there. It's a business book. You've put it across as a novel, and even within a novel, you've embedded a fable. So quite interesting. I think it'd be good if we start there for the audience without giving too much away, because I think it's better for people to actually read to the book. Can you give us a teaser of what the book is and then the inspiration for it as well?
Yeah. So the book comes. So actually, well, try to make this short. I wrote 2 books 20 years ago when I was running my company in France, payment software company. So those were books that were more technical, kind of. And after I redid my career at 50, I'd sold my company at 47, built this new career, executive coaching, leadership facilitation. I had begun to develop a desire to write a new book in this new area that I'm involved in. So I wrote a first version that was kind of like my old books, how to, 5 steps to better leadership, things like that. But I found it really, really boring. And what I really wanted to do was write something that was more experiential, visceral, that people could connect to emotionally. So it needed to be a novel, but that's a very different writing style. So it took me a few years. I had 3 writing coaches that would help me and that would beat me up on different areas. But what I was really trying to capture are the emotions that go with a senior leader, a senior executive going through transformation. 20% of the book is real. It's my own story when I was 50. This was 13 years ago now. But 80% is fiction. So the fiction element allowed me to create something that was a lot more fun and engaging than if I just told my own personal story all the way through. So that I wanted to learn to share these complex ideas with people without it being a how-to book or a teachy book. And that was very difficult for me to learn how to remove the teachy voice, remove the preaching voice, and just make it a story. So that I think that's kind of what you're asking. That's the
Yeah.
impetus.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. As in, you just mentioned that you had 20% of yourself in the book. How was it inserting yourself in the book? You could have written complete fiction. Was it easier putting 20% of yourself in the book, or not? As in, I'm curious about what it was like putting yourself in the story you're writing and still keeping it as fiction.
Yeah, it had started. It was a multi generation approach. This book. The first one, as I mentioned, was not at all fiction, so that was 100% me. And then it started getting fiction, and I started embellishing stories, and I would still use my name. And then at some point that just snapped. I just cut that cord and then threw away a lot, and there was a little bit that was left in there that was still me. So it was a gradual process of making it more fictional and less teachy, and it ended up with 20% that was left were things that were really my story. So people that know me will recognize pieces of it. 50-year-old man in Singapore. He had lived in France for a long time, originally from they're going to recognize that as me. Sold the company, moved here. And then some of the anecdotes are things that I really experienced. And then beyond that, it's all fiction.
Yeah, impressive. I think there's a phrase in the book. I think you put, "Pain is inevitable, suffering is optional."
Yeah.
Just curious. That was brilliant. Was that pure fiction? Did you go through that? I'm curious about that particular phrase because I found it it's easy to remember and very impactful, very
Yeah.
relevant.
Oh, that's a very, very common phrase in the mindfulness world. So who was it that first said that? I don't know. There are many mindfulness teachers over decades that have said something
Okay.
like that or the exact words. Um, Pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. I had heard it many years ago in Boulder, Colorado. There was a lot of Buddhist teaching involved there in the early 80s. I picked it up kind of, but I hadn't really thought about it a whole lot. And then later over the years, as I was also practicing mindfulness, that became bigger. And then that came into the book as a part of it. So I can't take credit for that statement. It is very nice. It is very simple to remember. And there's a huge amount of power behind it. And it can be extended far beyond mindfulness. So we can see it in a lot of areas, which the book does. The book describes it in a much more general fashion than mindfulness.
Nice, nice. So you were always talking about the fact that you're in a book. It'd be good to maybe tease out a little bit more about your personal journey of transformation. So what have you gone through and how did you go through transformation? Because you've reinvented your career, like you said. Many people are thinking about doing that, but very hesitant. They might be
Yeah.
fearful about that. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So I was originally a programmer, started 35 something years ago or even more, and then became a tech entrepreneur. First in the U.S. and then in the 80s I was in Italy and then France, and then I built a payment software company where I was living in the south of France. Grew it to 30 countries. My clients were banks around the world. Barclaycard in the UK, Visa, MasterCard, Amex, all these kinds of brands. Grew the organization. I had a large team in Singapore. So I had my core team in France, and then a much larger team in Singapore. All my R&D was being done out of Singapore. Sales and marketing for Asia Pac was here, so I was traveling here a lot. The company was sold in 2007, and I immediately thought I was going to be a serial entrepreneur because my identity was tech entrepreneur. I was CEO, chairman of my company. I was known in that space. I was giving talks around the world at banking conferences. That was my identity. And then I discovered that my heart wasn't in it anymore. I had already done it. I had already proven to myself I could do it. Against all the odds, I had succeeded. There were big failures and there were successes. So after selling the company, I had begun a process of self-reflection. What could I have done better? Where was I going next? At first, it was obvious I was going to be an entrepreneur, but I wasn't attracted to so much anymore. People that used to work for me became CEOs, CTOs, CFOs of other companies, and they would tell me that their favorite time was when they were working in my company, and I discovered that I really liked that more even than the technology I had created. So it was a painful, gradual process of discovering that I had within me more identities than the labels that I had built up over time. So then there was a process of reaching out to new labels that maybe weren't as juicy and how to put it, glamorous as the labels that I had before, letting go of the glamorous labels. And in that process was a liberation. There was pain, but there was also the joy of liberation. So that all of that is structured within my book. And I see it over and over again with the senior leaders that I work with, that I coach. There's always that kind of transformation that's happening throughout one's career, but at various degrees.
Yeah. Interesting. Because from you, it looks like you've had from your narration, there are two distinct transformations you've had. So it's like you say, you started as a programmer and then you switch to a tech entrepreneur. I think sometimes people don't realize that that's quite a big shift in itself, even though it's still tech. That is a big shift. And then you've shifted from a tech entrepreneur to now you're a coach, and you're doing that later in your life, which is it's another shift, and it's probably a more challenging shift. So that's quite interesting. It's interesting the story. So I've gone through something similar. So I started my career as a software engineer. And interestingly, in Singapore, at the time, I noticed a lot of software engineering roles were being moved out of London, where I live, into Singapore, into India. So then I deliberately made the choice to transition into becoming a change practitioner. So it took about a year, but then I made that transition. And so it's interesting. I can see that relation. A lot of people have gone through that, whether in their senior leaders or even later on in their careers, or early in their careers. We're seeing that need to look around and force that transformation. If not, you might end up in a place where you really don't want to be. So that's quite interesting. You mentioned something about having to gradually going through pain and taking off labels that were no longer relevant, no longer glamorous. Or, well, they might be glamorous, but you embrace labels that are less glamorous. Can you talk to that? How can leaders let go of redundant labels that no longer apply to their situation?
I like that you mentioned early in the career, because you're right, this is going on all the time. When you're a programmer and one day you've done really good work as a programmer and you're 28, 29, and then your company gives you a team of 3, 4, 5, 8 programmers to manage. If you continue seeing yourself primarily as a programmer, the way you lead and manage your team is going to be throttled. So at some point, you need to let go of that label and think of yourself, I'm a programmer, I know what that is, but now I'm a manager. It's a new label. And I'm going to probably have to adapt to people being much better programmers than I ever was. And I'll have to become open to hiring people that were better programmers than I ever was. That's quite a shift, but it's exactly the same kind of shift that I'm talking about. It's finding one's new value in an area where one has not proven oneself yet. and the discomfort of letting go of all the proven value of the past. And that kind of trust that I can still find value, even if I don't know what I'm doing yet, I still have some value there. That's not the same value as before. That's quite a shift. Later in life, it becomes even more it becomes even more difficult for people that if I've built 20 years, 25 years of value based on the knowledge that I have, the expertise that I had, and now I have to manage something, lead something with a bunch of people that I don't even know what they're doing, what is my value? And each individual has to find their new value in that space that's different from their experience and their expertise, their knowledge. And that can be really challenging, is to stretch that idea of where value comes from.
Yeah, indeed. Can we apply that to teams? So this is like you refer to like personal value. You have a personal label. If we use an example of like a sales team, maybe 5 years ago, the whole approach of the sales team is you have these very outward people who go out and they're going outbound. It's outbound. But today, people rather do the research and request themselves. So even if a salesperson comes in, the person you're selling to probably knows more about the product than the salesperson in reality. Is there a way of applying that notion of letting go of redundant labels to teams and maybe in organizations as well?
Yeah. That kind of, in my experience, and this is just my lens, that kind of transformation of salespeople is sometimes referred to as becoming a trusted advisor. That I was a salesman early in my life, enterprise sales, big stuff, and really good at it. And the next level up is to become a trusted advisor, which is quite a different label than a salesperson. And it can be difficult. It's a very lucrative shift to make. But then it's a transformation of how people see themselves. Why would a CEO trust me with my point of view? I'm just a salesman. But that's often the kind of, at that level, at a more senior level of transformation. So ideally, if you have a sales team and you're trying to take it to the next value, you probably want your sales team to kind of become trusted advisors to their clients. That's kind of a basic one. It's a very common transformation.
Okay. Are there any others you've seen about teams transforming themselves, or even organizations having to say, okay, we were a service company, now we're no longer a service company, we're now a data company? Because I'm seeing that with organizations, with industries being completely upended, organizations have to reinvent themselves.
Yeah.
And how do you do that? As in, I'm involved in interesting conversations where I'm like, okay, you have to let go of this. You can't just add more things. At some point, you have to define who you are.
Yeah. It's, we saw it with the mobile phones when the iPhone came out, and the traditional manufacturers called themselves mobile phone companies. That's how they thought about themselves. We're not an IT company, we're a mobile phone company, completely different. And then they stumbled. So we see it all the time. We've got AI coming in, ChatGPT, redefining how people think of what they do. We have COVID that forced organizations, teams that think of themselves as a silo, to step back and say, okay, how do we fit in with the rest of the organization? And is that changing? So all of that reflection is constant, which is why the book was written, is that these changes are happening a lot more. And the idea, the main theme in the book is to loosen our grip on these labels, not throw them away and then grab new ones, but just loosen the grip so that we're not holding it so strongly. And when we're not holding the grip, the labels so strongly, it's easier to kind of bend and let go of a label. If we need to let go of it, we may hold on to it longer, but we're not holding on to it in such a rigid manner, if that makes sense. The idea is to loosen up the way we hold on to these things. Not throw them away, but just loosen them up.
I like that. Just loosen them up, so you make room for transformation effectively. So instead
Yeah,
of just being so rigid, you make room for the transformation that
yeah,
needs to happen.
yeah.
Okay.
And we may decide quickly that we need to be rigid in a certain area for a certain time, but it becomes a choice rather than an automatic reaction.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. There's something from your book. You drew this correlation between parenting and the age at which you have, or the age of your
Yeah,
kids, and
yeah.
leadership style. And I found that very interesting. Can you
How old are
speak
your
to that?
kids?
Because my kids are not yet teenagers, so they're still. One of them is approaching and warning me every day that teenagers coming. So I'm not, but I'm not yet there. But I was very curious when I found that correlation, and I just thought it'd be brilliant for you to speak to our audience about that correlation between the age at which you have your kids and the way you lead.
Yeah. So it's a correlation I've seen over and over again. Um, we tend generally to manage our people at work in a similar way to the age of the children that we are raising, or that our peers are raising, because we're in similar age groups. So you will see senior executives up to the C-suite who tend to have teenage kids, just because that's where they are in life, um, are very KPI driven, very much into consequence, reward, stuff like that, the way they define things. And the organization needs that. Then you go to the board level, where board members tend to have adult children, and they've learned that you can't use that that style with adult children. There's a transition point even with teenage children where you need to start focusing more on outcomes, results, and what they want, and inspiring them toward what they want, rather than here's what I want, here are my rules, this is my home, and it'll happen like this until you no longer live here. So what I've just seen is it's simply that we spend so much energy with our kids, and that being a parent is such an important role in our lives. It's just natural that kind of energy carries on with us in other aspects. As soon as people
Yeah.
are aware of that, they go, oh, okay, I can take a step back. These are not my kids. These are not teenagers. These are full-blown adults. They've got kids of their own. It's quite easy to step back once people see that process is happening.
Yeah, interesting. I think that speaks to transformation in itself, that you're going through a transformation as your kids age.
Yeah.
You're going through a transformation in itself. Um, I'm curious, how did you discover this? Because once you said it, and I think I listened to it and I saw it in the book, I'm like, yes, this makes a lot of sense. But how did you find this out?
Okay. Let me share this part. This was a company I was coaching. I don't know, 8 years ago, 7 years ago. Um, there was a sense, I started to get a sense of the senior team. I was coaching a bit of the CEO, a lot the senior team, and the next level down, with group coaching, one-on-one coaching, a whole combination of elements. And I was having a growing sense that people felt they were treated as children, which is, we see that, we hear that a lot in companies. But here it was to the point that it just kept reappearing. And then I was in a meeting with the CEO, the CHRO, the head of HR, the three of them together, and myself. And the CEO was saying, why can't these people act like teenagers? They're acting like children. They should act like teenagers, more older, more independent, but they're like children, so dependent on stuff. And I'm listening to him, and I realized he had teenage children. And I asked him, well, what if they're adults and they're not children or teenagers? And it was just that it was a Freudian slip for him to say, why can't they be teenagers, rather than saying, why can't they be adults? And then it just dawned on me, he was he had transposed that parenting onto them. And then I had a click almost in that same moment. Years earlier, when I was running my company, I would sometimes confuse in my mind people's names in the company with my own children's names. And I used to wonder, why in the world would I do that? They don't even look like my children. But I realized that my brain was making some kind of correlation there. And it didn't make sense. But then when I saw him doing it, I was like, oh my, this is something many of us do. And then in my coaching, when I would see it again and I would ask people, how old are your kids? And they would say, and then the connection would be made. And then it's easy. Once they're aware of that, it's easy to step back and make different choices. So it's a fascinating thing. We are fascinating as human beings.
Yeah. It's really interesting because it points to how parenting is important. And a lot of times you think you can switch off the parent and turn up and be a leader. In reality, you can't fully switch off. I think to your point, as long as you're aware of it, you can then, don't hold the labels too tightly and adjust to the situation you're in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. If for leaders who, let's say we have a leader, I'm looking to get some practical advice for leaders. If we have a leader and they realize that it's self-evident, they need to go on a journey of transformation. That's become obvious. I think you've already given a lot of tips. Could you give any specifics as to what first steps leaders can take to begin that journey? Because sometimes that's the hardest part, is just to start.
That's the whole first chapter of my book. The journey begins when the leader, this is going to sound really trite, when the leader chooses to begin the journey, but that already is a big choice. So that comes often after a great deal of difficulty. And we only change because we really need to and want to. Not otherwise we stay the same. It's just easier to continue. So something happens in the leader's journey where he or she realizes in order to move forward and succeed and continue growing and succeeding, something's going to have to change in me. I need to grow. Before that realization is made, they'll stay. One of the most difficult situations in companies is when the top leader says, I don't need to, in essence, the top leader says, I don't need to change. You guys all need to change. And we're going to bring in this very high-powered company, consulting firm that knows how to do transformation and change. We're going to spend $5-10 million on this. You all are going to change. That doesn't work. It has to start with the leader coming to some kind of personal realization that he or she need to transform and be a role model in that transformation. So and that happens when they realize that the pain and difficulty of changing is smaller than the pain and difficulty of staying the same.
Yeah. Okay. So once you have that gradient where it changes more acceptable than staying the same, and then it's still a choice. The leader still has to make the choice to, I think it almost speaks to letting go of the current state. It's okay. The label I have for my current state, you let that go and begin to embrace a new label. Does it speak to commitment? I know you spoke to this in your book as well. That how do you get that 10 out of 10 commitment instead of saying, okay, I'm going to do this, but it's going to be like a 7 out of 10.
Yeah.
Is that really, it relates to that as well?
It's very much in that area. If I do some honest reflection and my commitment is to my status quo is a notch higher than my commitment to change, I'll stay in status quo. If I'm 8 out of 10 committed to status quo, 7 out of 10 committed to change, I'm going to stay in status quo. If I'm in status quo, most likely it's because that's where my commitment is. Um, the result is a manifestation of where my commitment is. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think
If I'm in
it
status quo, I'm
does.
committed to status quo.
Yeah, it does. As in, at the end of the day, you do need to make the commitment to change, and it has to be a lot more than the commitment you have to the status quo. You do have to
Yeah,
let go of the status quo to embrace transformation.
yeah.
Um, are there examples you can share, as in that you're comfortable sharing, of leaders who've actually gone through this journey and transformed themselves, and it's made a difference to the organizations?
Um, I have examples. So I do cite a few examples in my book without naming the actual people. So names were changed, the genders in some cases changed. One example that I use in my book, I think the primary one with the 10 out of 10. This was it's a story in the book. It's a real event. Story in the book of a man in India who runs a textile factory, managing director of a textile factory that's facing workplace accidents and fatalities. And they had spent a lot of time and money in putting in place the systems and processes and dashboards and things like that for safety, but they were still having these accidents. So I asked the gentleman, how committed are you to safety? And he said, very high, 9 out of 10. And so the conversation became, maybe that's why people are dying. Obviously, 9 is very high. If it was 8, more people would be dying. But maybe there's, if you feel it's 9 out of 10, something is missing. Otherwise, you'd say 10. And as I describe in my book, he got angry with me. Um, I'm committed. 9 out of 10 is 10 out of 10 is impossible. These people do crazy things. If they see a forklift going down the shop floor and they need to get to the other end, they'll jump on the front of the forklift, even though they know they're not supposed to. I can't be on everybody's back. 10 out of 10 means I have to be on everybody's back. So there was a gradual exploration. He went through a gradual exploration to his full credit. I mean, he reacted strongly, but then reflected. Um, and his exploration was, what is 10 out of 10 commitment? Maybe it's not being on everyone's back, but what is it in my commitment that's missing? So in the book, I described what he discovered, and he did discover a little extra, and the accidents and fatalities came down because he was able to stretch himself. But it came with this intense pain and self reflection of trying to avoid more fatalities. It's the stakes were high.
Yeah, I think that's a very I think I read that story as well. It's very impactful transformation. As in, I didn't actually realize that was a real story. I thought that was pure one of part of the fiction as well. So that is actually quite impactful. And that is a life and death impact of a leader's transformation. So it shows the
Yeah,
importance of leaders, the importance of commitment, and important
yeah,
on going on that journey of transformation.
yeah,
Um, Very interesting. If I relate it to, there's a couple of companies that we think of when we think about transformation. So I think you've used leaders. I'm trying to see how we can and correlate that to companies themselves. I think of like a company like Netflix, who started as a company renting out DVDs, and they had to remove that label of we are a company that rents out DVDs and we're a streaming company, and they made that transformation. I think another one that comes to mind is probably Starbucks. I think probably less known is Starbucks started as a company that sold coffee beans and coffee making machinery, and with new ownership, effectively new leadership, they changed and became a chain of coffee houses, and that's the Starbucks we know today. It's still the same thing of stepping out and going on that journey of transformation. So quite interesting. Any thoughts you have on companies? Is there any difference between companies transforming, or is it still the same thing of just leaders on companies taking that personal journey to
Yeah.
transform? Is that the way you say it as well?
There's a phrase, I'm not going to remember, unfortunately, who said this originally, but it's repeated a lot. Organizations don't change, people change. Organizations are the result of people agreeing to do things in a certain way. So organizations don't change, people do change. So organizations don't transform, people transform. And then they transform the organization to fit their new way of looking at the world. So it really starts with the individuals. It can start at the top and then reflect down, ripple down, or it can start in an area and then ripple up. It's kind of moving. It can start in an industry and ripple out, but it's always people choosing something different, thinking of themselves in a different way, interacting with each other in a different way, choosing. A dysfunctional team can, from one day to the next, choose to be a trusting and cohesive team. But it's the individuals that choose, and then the organization is transformed.
Indeed.
It sounds obvious, but we often forget.
Yeah, I like that. It's another one that, it's like you say, it sounds obvious. It's easy to remember as well, and as long as you're aware of it, it's not organizations that are changing; it's people that are changing.
Yeah,
And the focus needs to be on the people. You can see the outcome of that in the organization,
exactly.
but it's the people that change.
Exactly. Do you watch Ted Lasso?
I do not. I've heard a lot about it, but I do not watch it. No.
There's a lot of what he does in that show. That's what we're talking about.
Okay.
He's transforming the people in the team. The outcome is the results of winning matches. He doesn't care about winning matches, actually. He cares about creating a trusting and cohesive team that's willing to work together in new ways and grow and stuff. That's what he's creating, changes in these team players. So it's fascinating to watch it through a popular TV show.
Okay, I'll do some research. Maybe I need to pick that up as well and find time for that. So in closing, it would be good to know, because we just went straight into the topic. Who is Aneace Haddad? Can you describe yourself? Who are you? And obviously, how can people reach out to you and get your book?
So who am I? That's harder to answer. Reaching out to me, www.aneace.com, ANEACE.com. That's easy. My book is on there. It's on Amazon. The Eagle That Drank Hummingbird Nectar. Who am I? I've gone through that process. I am not this, I am not that I describe in my book to loosen the labels. So some of the obvious labels: I'm an executive coach, leadership facilitator in Singapore, American who left America 40 years ago, almost 40 years ago. I'm a person who really loves the complexity of being human and the joy of being human and changing, and how all of this mixes at work and at home. Yeah, I don't know how else to describe. I love this kind of transformation. I've struggled with it. I still struggle with it. But I love seeing this growth. It feels like, because we're going to be living, hopefully, such long lives compared to our grandparents and great-grandparents, we have to get better at it. And it feels like that's kind of my role in this later portion of my life, helping senior leaders get better at this.
It's an important role. I think that's a very important role, to your point. And I think even for people who are just starting their careers, it's very easy to start at the beginning of your career and be really daunted. Like, what am I going to do? And what do I even know will be here in 10, 20 years?
Yeah.
I remember asking a head teacher once, what are you teaching the kids? Because the world's going to change before they start work.
Yeah.
And we had a nice, interesting conversation about that. So I think it's an important role, but to your point, like ability to teach people how to transform and reinvent themselves.
Over and
I
over
think it's an
again.
important role. Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. Any final comments, anything I've not asked that you want to speak to before we close?
No, I love this. This is a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time. I'll definitely be in touch and speak soon. Take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to my conversation with Aneace. I've certainly learned more about the connection between personal transformation and organizational transformation. If this episode was of value to you, please consider leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts. I'd like to invite you to continue the conversation on our community website, thechangelead.com. Our free community website provides a platform to share and discuss the challenges of leadership and change with fellow professionals. You can find all previous episodes on our website, so please be sure to visit the site, thechangelead.com. And when you go, click join to join the conversation. Now, would you like to connect with today's guest, Aneace? You can find his details in the show notes. Finally, please don't forget, like, comment, review, and subscribe. Thank you very much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your day, and see you next time.